welcome back to another episode of How Did We Not Know That? My name's Jack.
I'm Nat.
And I'm David.
And so we have a very special guest. David is going to be talking to us about something exciting related to voting. Very excited to hear about it. Because voting is coming up. So
in the United States, the U.S. is about to have a really big election this fall. So David's going to educate us on voting.
Yeah. So as of today, we are 93 days out from the election. It's going to be pretty insane. Probably the most unique election of our lifetimes. During a pandemic, countless Americans are getting prepared to vote by mail. We have no idea what things are going to look like. Lines that are already pretty long are going to be social distanced with 6 feet between people. We might have some lines stretching a mile long across cities. Not to discourage people, but people need to be prepared ahead of time with how they're going to vote this year. If people are going to vote by mail, they should be applying for ballots already.
David actually is the one who encouraged me to register absentee so I can vote by ballot this fall. So good job, David.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you for doing so. But yeah, voting by mail is pretty interesting in the United States too, because like I live in Montana. 40% of people here vote by mail on a normal year. Just everyone does it.
Is it because like polling places are far apart, or like?
That's a big part of it, because I mean Montana is insanely spread out, but also kind of the culture of the West, you know, like Oregon and Washington, ballots are automatically mailed to registered voters. Even like all across the West, in Arizona, 80% of people vote by mail. It's you come out, you go out west and it's the norm.
Yeah. Question, David, because don't you? Oh, sorry. David's from Nebraska. I just know this because we're pals. But so you're voting in Montana this fall, are you? Or
yeah.
Okay, so how does that work if you're from Nebraska? What if you're from one state and you move to another state? Which state do you vote for? Where do you register absentee?
Well, you can only vote in one state, and it has to be a state where you live. So for me, I could vote in either Nebraska or Montana because I'm a permanent resident of Nebraska technically, and I'm registered to vote there. But there are different rules for each state for who can vote. In Montana, they're really relaxed. You have to live here for 30 days. Like that's, I don't know what else, but it's very simple. And I will have been here for a lot more than 30 days. So, So yeah, I'll be voting in Montana. But then like also like I voted in Ohio 2 years ago, but I don't have an address there anymore. So I can't vote there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I did the same thing. Like I was out of state when I was at OSU, but I still voted in Ohio in the 2016 elections. Also, I have a question for you too. Can you vote by mail in every state, or are there some states that don't allow it?
You can in every state, but there are some states where you need a reason.
Oh.
You need to prove why you want to vote by mail.
Gotcha.
And for the pandemic, since we're in a pandemic, you would hope that everyone would say, yeah, you can vote by mail, but unfortunately not. I think that like 40 states you can vote by mail, at least during the pandemic though.
Gotcha. Okay.
Do you have a list of states by any chance off the top of your head where you would have to prove that you need to vote by mail?
Overwhelmingly be from the South.
Okay.
Gotcha.
The thing about voting by mail is it can be tricky for the infrastructure of a state. Like in Michigan, in 2016, 500,000 people voted absentee in their primary. But for the 2020 primary, 2 million people voted absentee.
Whoa.
And it's hard for states to handle that uptick of volume, which is why if you're voting by mail, you want to do so way ahead of time. You want to be super prepared. Also, for mail-in ballots or absentee voting, your ballot will be mailed to your address. Then you can either mail it back out to your election office, or you can drop it off in person at your election office or a secure drop box. And that's a good idea for this election, to not overwhelm the mail services.
Yeah. Yeah, oh my gosh, that's crazy. Like, because also I'm thinking about the people who have to like count these ballots and like count these votes, and like you also have to be safe and like socially distanced while you're doing that as well. So that must be really stressful. Like, I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of time too to prepare. Yeah, to go from the 500,000 people to 2 million. So,
and I think too, at least in Ohio, it has to be received before a certain date. Like they can't receive it on election day, from my understanding. So is that like a standard for all of the states? Is there like a certain time that you should be making sure you've mailed your ballot in?
It varies per state. There are some states where it has to be received by election day. There are other states where it has to be postmarked by election day. So they can come in days later and still count. But especially out east, like I think I was reading that Michigan ballots have to be received by election day. Like I don't think it matters when it was sent.
And election day is what day this year?
November 3rd.
Okay, so if you're voting absentee, make sure that you send out your ballot way before November 3rd, so you can make sure that it counts.
I would say like 3 weeks if you're mailing it.
yeah.
And if you're pushing it close, bring it to a secure drop box or your election office.
If I register to vote absentee, do you know when they're supposed to send that to me? If I like haven't received my ballot by a certain date, is there something I should do? Someone I should contact?
Well, you would want to contact your local election office. It honestly varies by state. There's some states where this is a lot more difficult than others. I can speak mostly for Montana, where it's pretty easy here. You can track your ballot, but I don't think that's offered in every state. You want to talk to your local election office or check the Secretary of State website for your state. So yeah, when you ask a lot of people why they vote, I think they'll say because we live in a democracy and it's important to make your voice heard, or you can't complain about what happened. That's definitely true. And the reason voting is important for me is that, you know, in a democracy, the more people that vote, the harder it is for the government to get away with doing whatever they want, no matter how it might impact their citizens. So the more people that vote, the more politicians feel the consequences of their constituents and have to accurately represent everyone. Unfortunately, a lot of America's history has been the story of some people trying to stop others from voting. I think we like to think that that's something of the past that ended with the civil rights era, but we have not progressed past voter suppression being an issue. And it's actually been revving up a lot recently as people have relaxed their focus in recent years, thinking we've moved on from certain issues. Voter suppression today is actually as serious as it's been in a long time. I've seen a lot of people talking about how like 46% of Americans didn't vote in the last election. Like, get off your couch, you need to go. Like, it's your fault that for whatever's happened. And like, I even read a Washington Post article that was titled "About 100 million Americans couldn't be bothered to vote this year."
Wait, 46% did not vote in the last election?
Yeah. But the thing is, it's not always that simple as saying 100 million people couldn't be bothered to get up and go vote. A lot of those people wanted to vote, may have actively tried to vote, and simply not been able to. Because for some people, the barriers for voting are impossible to get past. It's hard to wrap your mind around sometimes, especially like voting's always been so easy for me. I've been able to just walk right in, no line, cast my vote and go. But it's not like that for everyone.
Can we talk about some of the barriers that people face when going to vote?
Yeah, one of the big ones is shutting polling locations. In a second, I'll talk about the Voting Rights Act and how it was rolled back in 2013. That caused a lot of states to flat out start closing mass amounts of polling locations and implementing these strict voter ID laws. Yeah, those are two of the main reasons. That all really starts with the Voting Rights Act. So I'll backtrack a second to talk about that. So yeah, I think everyone associates the Voting Rights Act with one of the landslide victories of the civil rights eras. And it was, certainly. Prior to that, some states in the South used loopholes to make their primaries whites only. So minorities could vote in the general election, but it wouldn't matter by then because the candidates would pretty much already be selected. African Americans would be intimidated by the police and local militias when they attempted to vote. Like, you would have to be a hero to even try to vote in certain states back then. But with the Voting Rights Act, that cut back poll taxes, literacy tests, it increased polling locations in minority areas, and it was a very proactive policy. So areas that had a history of discriminating had to have new laws they were trying to implement be approved before they were even put into place. So states couldn't just try and pass this discriminatory act and wait for someone to step in. They had to get that approved ahead of time, which wouldn't happen most of the time. That was a major turning point in voting rights in the United States.
Can we do a refresher on like the poll taxes and the literacy test?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so poll taxes, essentially, voters would have to pay a tax every time they wanted to vote. And for a lot of places, this tax was cumulative. So if you took elections off, that poll tax would grow higher and higher. So if someone was 40 years old and was like, I want to go vote for the first time, boom, look, they'd have this massive poll tax they had to pay.
Wow. I didn't realize it was cumulative. That's insane.
Yeah.
At least in some states. And it was targeted at mostly African Americans and Hispanic voters. And literacy tests, citizens would have to take these insane tests proving that they know the laws of their local community. And if you read those literacy tests, they're insane. Like, no one could possibly pass them.
Yeah.
And they pretty much only administered them to minority voters. So like they selectively used these like poll taxes and literacy tests to stop minorities from voting.
Yeah.
Back to the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, the Supreme Court decided to roll back the Voting Rights Act. By their logic, issues of voter suppression, racism wasn't really an issue anymore in the states the Voting Rights Act initially targeted. They said at this point it's kind of discriminatory towards these southern states who have to get all of their policies approved. So they decided to roll back the Voting Rights Act because there was, in their words, no need for it anymore. As you can imagine, as soon as they did that, insidious voter suppression tactics started coming back. After that, about 1,000 polling locations were closed in 9 states alone.
1,000?
Yeah, and that happens primarily in African American, Hispanic communities where residents might not have access to a vehicle, maybe not even public transportation, and have to walk miles to vote. And there may be one polling location.
That's ridiculous. Voting day isn't a holiday federally, but are there some states that make it a paid work holiday?
I don't believe there are any states. I'm not sure, but there has been a lot of talk about that recently. I know I've seen some companies letting their workers off on election day, but there has been more talk about that recently. At the same time, states started implementing voter ID laws. Along with this, a lot of them started shutting down DMVs, which is where you go to get a driver's license. And again, this happened mostly in Black communities. I read that in some areas in Texas, you have to drive 250 miles to get a voter ID.
Oh my gosh, what?
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
And you have to have like a birth certificate or certain documents to prove you are who you are. And not everyone has those. Maybe if you weren't born in a hospital, that's not so easy to get.
It takes a long time to get like a copy of your birth certificate. And it's a lot of money too. Like it's ridiculous.
Unreasonable. So to see the actual effects of that in Milwaukee in 2016 compared to 2012, 50,000 fewer votes were cast in the presidential election.
Whoa.
Wow.
And a lot of media was saying like the African American enthusiasm is not as high, but no, they weren't able to vote because their polling locations were gutted and they implemented a strict voter ID law.
Sorry, I have another question. So what is like the justification that these states use to implement these laws? Why are they saying this is a beneficial thing?
Yeah, well, for the polling locations, it's basically efficiency reasons or like saving money, but they mostly only cut them in minority communities, keeping multiple polling locations open in white communities with significantly fewer citizens.
Oh my God.
For the voter ID laws, it's in an effort to fight voter fraud. I'll touch on that near the end.
Okay.
But spoiler alert, those voter ID laws don't have any impact at all on voter fraud.
Interesting.
So that's why they're justified, but there's no statistical basis for it. Another voting rights debacle in America is felon voting rights. In the United States, it's really difficult for felons to vote, sometimes impossible. There are only 4 democracies in the world that restrict voting rights after someone leaves prison, and the United States is one of them.
Wow.
Felon disenfranchisement, or like felons not being able to vote, that varies state by state. In Maine and Vermont, felons can vote in prison.
Okay.
They don't lose their voting rights, but that is the exception.
It's a big deal because like we have the most, like the highest per capita rate of incarceration, or like what do you like? We just have like the most
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
world.
Oh yeah. Like we have like a historical high for citizens imprisoned. Even when rights are restored to felons, though, it's not always that simple. In Florida, in 2018, the state voted to restore voting rights to felons, which was a big deal. But then the Florida legislature came out and said, but you have to pay your court fees first.
Oh.
And for some of those felons, their court fees are thousands upon thousands of dollars. It's hard to get a job after you're out of prison, and paying that off is no easy task at all. So that's basically a modern day poll tax.
Yeah, like being required to pay money to vote, like that does not sound very democratic.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, it's not.
Yeah. So yeah, in Alabama, the legislature came out and said that felons couldn't vote if they had committed a crime of moral turpitude, but they didn't state what that meant. And they didn't tell the felons whose rights had been restored.
Oh no.
So no one knew if that meant them or not.
Yeah, they didn't tell you like your crime was moral. What does that even mean?
Turpitude,
Turpitude?
like,
That sounds like a fake word.
It's like severity or something.
Okay.
And if they went to sign up to vote, they would have to check if they had committed a crime of moral turpitude under fear of prosecution.
Well, who's the one deciding? Like,
Yeah, is it a judge or what? And then do they have to pay court fees for that judge to decide if it's moral turpitude?
It would be the attorney general,
wow.
The courts. So no one knew. They would go to vote and be like, I don't know if this is me or not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's like, are they classifying, like, do they have to do case by case, person by person, or is it like caught with a certain offense, like all people, if it's like a drug offense, like, but I don't know, but like, what if it's like person per person, and then that's gonna take forever to like figure out if you qualify.
Yeah, I think that was the point, to make it difficult, to make people confused, to not know if they can vote or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, all in all, there are 6 million Americans who have lost the right to vote, and like that only hurts our democracy.
I was like talking to like my Australian friends, and then I think it's the same in Britain and Malaysia. In those countries, apparently voting is mandatory, so they always have to, like, you're legally required to vote in every election, and so they always have 100% turnout. You could choose to abstain your vote, but you still have to like tell the government like, oh, I'm abstaining my vote. And like at first I was like, my like gut reaction to that was like, I'm an American, government can't tell me what to do.
Classic.
But like, I don't know, like what I feel like that's kind of like what a true democracy means, like everyone, that way, like you can't be restricting people's votes. What do you guys think about that? Because I'm sure there's like a lot of pros and cons.
I think there's so many barriers that we're talking about right now to voting. If you required like felons to vote, which means you'd require them to pay court fees, I think that's not awesome, not super feasible for our country right now. But I think that that's the point that we want to get to. I think having the option to abstain easily. I think that we should also utilize technology with voting. I don't know if we have a bunch of Luddites in politics or what. Luddite is like someone who's scared of technology. But like, I think
definitely.
I think we should start utilizing technology to make voting more accessible. Ideally, that's where we'd want to be. I think that's a better idea. It's mandatory to at least say that you're abstaining from voting, or to actually place your vote.
If anyone happened to watch a bit of Congress questioning the tech CEOs last week, I think you would get that they don't have much technological knowledge. Yeah, I think, have either of you heard of the Electoral Integrity Project? It's the most accurate measurement for free and fair elections, the most commonly used one. In 2016, they came out with a report that basically said that North Carolina isn't a democracy. Their electoral rating was so bad that they fell somewhere between Iran and Venezuela. One party is overwhelmingly receiving seats in regards to how the people vote. The main issue was voting district boundaries. If you know what gerrymandering is, it's drawing district boundaries in a way that helps your party. So Republicans in power will decide to redistrict the state and draw out the voting boundaries between districts. If the state is maybe like 55% Republican and 45% Democrat, they may be able to draw those boundaries to make them have 12 Republican seats versus 3 Democratic seats. The Electoral Integrity Project found that North Carolina's integrity of voting district boundaries was lower than any country on earth.
So their boundaries, like their voting district boundaries, are just so, like, you could tell it's been manipulated so much and it's like so unnatural.
Yeah.
Correct? Okay.
They give them all these crazy names like frog splattered on a windshield because the districts look like they make no logical sense on how they look because they're drawn specifically to increase voting power for a certain party.
So I know in our example we said the Republican Party. Does this happen on both sides, or is there like a particular side that has done this more often historically?
Yeah, both parties have done it, mostly Republican. Both parties have done this to their own advantage in unfair ways. Mm-hmm. But if you look at how things stand now, like Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, their districts are drawn in ways that disproportionately favor Republicans.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's interesting. It'd be interesting to see like the ratio between states that are gerrymandering and what political party represents that state.
Yeah, like Wisconsin's a pretty split state, mm-hmm. Like, but their state legislature is overwhelmingly Republican. This is something that gets fought in the courts, and but honestly, a lot of the time the courts rule you need to redraw your boundaries, and then they just redraw them in another gerrymandering way.
It's one way to get around it.
it's a hard problem to solve.
Definitely. Also, I'm curious, where did that term come from, gerrymandering? Is there a guy whose name was Gerrymander who started this?
It's from the early colonial days.
So this has been an ongoing issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah, it was first used in 1812 because the first time it was done, it resembled the shape of a salamander.
Oh. What?
It was the governor's last name put together with the word salamander.
Very creative.
Natalie, you asked earlier about why voter ID laws are implemented. The justification for that is to stop voter fraud. But when you look at all the elections between 2000 and 2016, that's 5 presidential elections. How many more small ones? That is 1 billion votes. There were only 44 incidents of voter fraud out of 1 billion.
Whoa.
That's a 0.000004% chance. You're more likely to win an Olympic gold medal.
Dang.
Yeah.
Wow.
And all of those incidents of voter fraud they did find, 3 of them would have been stopped by a voter ID.
I feel like the voter fraud debate I hear all the time, but I actually didn't know the numbers behind it. So I'm glad you put them in the episode.
Yeah, the whole point is putting that on the agenda, making people worried about it. Nowadays, you hear everyone talking about mail-in voting fraud, but actually, voting by mail, those ballots are under much more scrutiny than normal voting. The only real problem with them is that way too many are rejected because they'll check your signature to see if it matches the signature on your ID. Those ballots are actually under more scrutiny, and a decent number of them do get rejected.
Wow.
Also, millions upon millions of voters have been purged from the voter rolls to stop voter fraud. That's the thing, these accusations of voter fraud are speculation, but the voter purging is real.
Well, what
Like,
does
why
it mean?
these state governments will remove voters from the voter registration list because they think maybe they moved out of state or something. They see someone who's registered in multiple states. But there have been so many flaws with that. People have been like, I voted in the primary election 3 months ago and you purged me from the voter roll. And a lot of people show up to vote on election day and find out that they've been purged from the voter roll to stop voter fraud.
Oh my gosh. And can you register the day of to vote or no? Like, what if you got purged and then you showed up and
Only
that happened?
you'd be out of luck. That's another thing. Like in Montana, you can register the day of the election. It's so easy out here. But like you go to like Georgia, there are so many barriers. It's ridiculous. It shouldn't even be a partisan thing. There is reason to be very careful with voting and to double check that you're registered, to know how you're voting, especially this year. Like if you're voting in person, try to vote early if you can. A lot of states offer early voting. Take safety precautions. If you're voting by mail, make sure your signature matches your ID. Mail in your ballot far ahead of time. Take that ballot, drop it off at a drop box if you can. Request an absentee ballot now. For me, like, you know, you hear a lot of people talk about how they don't like politics, how they're disillusioned, but I don't think that's any excuse not to vote. And for me, that comes down to the stories of all those who have fought so hard for the right to vote. You look at how many people are trying to vote and have such difficulties in doing so. I don't think you can look at that and say, well, I don't want to vote because I don't really like either candidate. I know we want candidates that perfectly fit everything we want, all our policy wishes, but it rarely works like that. And there is a difference in the leaders that we choose, even if we don't like our options. And it's the vulnerable communities that most feel the effects of that, which I think everyone needs to remember when they vote. I don't think voting has to be a cure-all. Your vote isn't going to change everything, but it's a first step. It's an important one. And for some of us, it's easy.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I agree. It's not just voting in the general election, local elections, primaries, every single chance you get to cast a vote. It's a privilege and responsibility for American citizens to cast a vote whenever you can.
Local elections have like the lowest turnout out of all of our different types of elections, but like honestly, they're so important. State officials, county officials, town officials, they have a lot more power than people realize. Like attorney generals, I realized until recently, like, oh man, like I didn't realize how much legislation they impact.
Yeah, the attorney general's the one doing the moral turpitude. What is it?
Turpitude.
Turpituity. You gotta pick the right one.
Encourage everyone to like do their research. I think there are a lot of websites that I think break down all the candidates for like all these like various positions. I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Let's try to link that in like the description on the YouTube channel and the podcast, because I'm going to get off my high horse. I will be the first one to say I do not vote in every single election. I'm really like giving good advice that I should be taking. I need to vote more often, and I do not educate myself as much as I should to be a good voter. And that's something that I'm working on changing and making an effort to get better at. We're all learning, and we're all learning how to be better, proactive citizens of our country.
For sure.
Yeah.
I completely agree. Even in like the 2016 election, like in the general election, I just voted for like president. Like all the other like local officials that were on the ballot, I kind of like, I just abstained and I skipped through because I was like, oh, I didn't even realize they were up for election. I'm like, I don't know who these people are. And like all these positions are so important. So everyone should do their research.
Definitely. Especially all the new young voters. Our demographic for this podcast is quite young. So some of you may be voting for the first time. So get excited, get educated, and get ready to vote for this fall.
For sure.
That's right. So for my job, I've been talking to a lot of voters across America. I talked to this one lady. She was 75 years old. I asked her if she would vote absentee. She was like, nothing short of death will stop me from voting. She was like, if I become sick, I will have my children keep me on life support until November 3rd. This lady is my hero. I think our generation needs more of that. You talk to the older generation, they're always like, yes. Nothing will stop me.
I was like an election judge one year, and I swear like 80% of the people that came to vote were like over the age of 65. I was like, wow.
Well, I mean, think about that demographic. If you're over 65, you probably grew up civil rights era, so you know how much of an honor it is to be able to like have your voice represented.
That's true.
Thank you so much,
Well-
David, for doing this episode and educating us on how to vote. Everyone, get excited.
Yeah, thanks for having me on your show.
Of course.
I-
Come back
I'm an
anytime.
honored guest.